Hi, Smarter News. We have a real diverse selection of news stories today to get you going midweek with a lot of different topics. And an interesting theme came up as I'm looking across these different news stories, and that's a central question, which is who's in charge? I don't know about you, but as a young person growing up, you look at adults and you think, wow, they really have it all together. They really know what's going on. But then you become an adult and you realize that no one really knows what's going on. And there is that fundamental question a lot about who's in charge. I know I have that question in my own life, but in these stories, I think you'll see who's in charge is a central question that we may have that we don't necessarily have the answer for or the reason why someone or an entity is in charge. So I'm going to go through a couple different stories. One of the first stories I want to mention to you is something that's happening today. It's something we haven't seen in a really long time, and that is a pretrial hearing at Guantanamo Bay for some of the most, if not the most high-profile detainees, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, otherwise known as KSM, who is admittedly and has talked about being one of the main plotters of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, among other crimes, including other terrorist attacks and murders. This pretrial hearing is taking place more than a year since the last pretrial hearing. And so there's been constant delays on Guantanamo Bay for these 5 key detainees, all of which have apparently played a role in some way in 9/11. And to be most accurate, because they're on trial, we're going to continue to call these allegations, even though in the case of KSM, they've admitted to these crimes. And so there's been a lot of frustration about why this trial is taking so long. And so here's a couple reasons why. I mean, there's just logistical challenges with being at Guantanamo Bay. There's been all sorts of really serious questions as well about evidence gathered from enhanced interrogation techniques. You've likely heard about that over the years. There's also been the pandemic, one of the reasons why the pretrial hearings were put on hold. There's a question now about the judge in the case. So you see, all of this is just slowing down this march towards an actual trial, which anyone's best guess is when it will actually happen. Here's one of the court sketches yesterday. This is a traditional dye on the beard that some were apparently had along with some of their more traditional dress. So you can kind of understand what you're looking at here. The detainees came in mass. They took off their masks once they were in the trial. And there was all sorts of descriptions coming from journalists that are able to witness this event that were saying that there was sort of this jovial tone, even waves to the journalists from some of the detainees. So the timing of this is where it comes into the question of who's in charge here, because we know that pretrial hearings really, they can take place at really any time, but this pretrial hearing is taking place right at the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the crime in which the hearing is about. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is charged with nearly 3,000 charges of murder against him. So this is the seriousness of this crime. And yet there's this slow march towards justice, and even now a question about how will justice even take place? So that's taking place today. I think you should know about that. In the meantime, I want to show you something here, and this sort of brings the stories together. So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was found in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, back many, many years ago, before Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, though, was found in Abbottabad. These are both 2 sites in Pakistan. You can see you could drive between them in about 2 hours. And let me show you this here, because I'm going to switch over to Afghanistan in a moment. My main point here is how close some of these locations are to where we're talking about in Afghanistan, including Kabul. So yesterday we talked about a protest happening in the streets, sometimes described as an anti-Pakistan protest, but really it's because of the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban. Pakistan is looked at as supporting the Taliban for years and years and years. We've talked about the Haqqani network as well, which is a foreign terrorist organization as designated by the State Department that is believed to be mainly in Pakistan, mainly along this tribal area. I'm kind of drawing the border for you between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I want you to keep that in mind. Keep in mind where some of these Al-Qaeda operatives were found, which is in Pakistan. And then I want to show you this. One of the big news items yesterday was this list of what's been described as temporary ministers for the new Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. But these are the leaders of the new government in Afghanistan, every single one of them Taliban members. However, something that you should know is a name that we've talked about in the past. This is when we talk about the Haqqani network, this is Haqqani. This is one of the main figures in the Haqqani network. This is a most wanted sign from the FBI, seeking $10 million for information to the capture of this man. This man is now head of the interior minister of Afghanistan. So a known terrorist, as designated by the United States, is now one of the leading figures of the new Afghanistan. We don't really have to go through every single other member. That's one of the facts that you should know. This is why obviously there's concern about the new government, because why were we in Afghanistan? We were in Afghanistan because we do not want Afghanistan to be a safe haven for terrorists. Now a known terrorist is one of the leading positions in the new government of Afghanistan. That's important to know. One of the questions that comes up repeatedly, and this comes back to who's in charge, is the State Department and others, not only in the United States, but others talking about whether or not the Taliban wants to be, part of the international community, to have access to the international community and resources in any number of ways, including banking. One of the questions that we should be asking, though, is whether or not the Taliban actually is seeking legitimacy and whether or not that's something that they actually want from the international community. Because if that's something that they don't necessarily want, then that's not something they're going to be incentivized by. And based on their selections of who's in the government, they're not really worried about how they're perceived around the world, because clearly that's a direct move to put a known terrorist in front of your government as the head of the Interior Ministry. So that's something you should know about what's happening in Afghanistan. Back here at home, we have a few different stories that we're watching. And I'm going to make a sharp turn here, but I think this is important because I always want to capture some of the headlines that you're seeing and give you something smarter. Sometimes that includes celebrity news. And you know what? Sometimes we can actually cover foreign policy, terrorism, and celebrity news in the same breath. I think it's okay, as long as we have our priorities straight. And national security, your personal security, I think is paramount. So that's why we're going to lead with the most important stuff. But I'm also going to give you some information as we see it when you see other headlines, such as the one that we just got about one of the most popular and well-known pop stars in the entire world, and that's Britney Spears. There's been all of this conversation about her legal status and debate over conservatorship. And we just got news last night that her father is officially appealing to the court to say he's withdrawing his conservatorship. Here's the one thing that I actually think is really important about this story that sort of cuts through some of the, more salacious headlines. In my reporting, what I learned about conservatorship is that it's really reserved. That's when someone can take over your affairs if you're really unable in any way, like incapacitated to function. So, being depressed, having a mental illness, some of these things that have been sort of rumored around Britney Spears, but never actually presented in court, these wouldn't be typical reasons that someone could take conservatorship or take charge of certain parts of her life. So the fact that conservatorship was actually granted 13 years ago is a really interesting fact because it's not typical to happen. So the question is there a lot of information that we don't know? Or is conservatorship being applied in ways that really it shouldn't be, not only in her case, but in others? And that's an important part of the story that I think sort of transcends just some of the pop culture headlines. So just something to think about today. All kind of comes into like who's in charge? Who's in charge of someone's life? Who's in charge of a government? Who's in charge of making some of these decisions about the timing of this pretrial hearing for some of these really high-profile detainees at Guantanamo Bay? Those are some of the themes I'm looking at today. I'd be curious what you'd like to learn more about. Please let me know. Questions and comments, as always. We're going to have more. I've been watching a couple different stories percolating about the pandemic. Haven't forgotten about that. Obviously, that's a really big story, really internationally. So we're going to have more on that over the next couple days. But hope these headlines are helpful. A couple really important things to watch. And thank you for all your support. All of this information and more on smarternews.com. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you later.